Welcome to our deep dive, into the world of Peter Abelard, 12th century philosopher, theologian.
Quite the figure.
And just all around fascinating figure, I think. And we're going to be using the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy on Abelard to kind of get everybody up to speed.
Great source.
On, his life, his big ideas, and why he still matters today. And trust me, this isn't just like some boring history lesson.
Oh, no. Wow.
Abelard was known for his sharp wit and even sharper tongue.
Yeah, his rhetoric.
Legend has it.
Yeah.
He never lost an argument.
Never lost an argument. It's amazing.
Plus, his love affair with Héloïse is like the stuff of legends full of passion and tragedy.
The ultimate love story.
And get this, he was a champion of reason and faith.
Yes.
Which put him at odds with some seriously powerful figures like Bernard of Clairvaux.
That's right.
Yeah.
He wasn't afraid to ruffle some feathers. He was brilliant, controversial, and ahead of his time in many ways.
So let's unpack this a little bit. What kind of world did he live in, and what were his early years like?
Well, imagine Europe in the 12th century, a time of intense intellectual and religious ferment.
Yeah.
Abelard was born in 1079 in a small town in Brittany, France.
Okay.
Now, here's where it gets interesting. He was actually in line to inherit his father's wealth and title.
Oh, wow.
Which would have set him up for a comfortable life as a knight.
Wait, so he could have been a knight in shining armor? I wouldn't have pegged him as the knightly type.
Right.
Yeah.
But instead, he chose a different path, a path of the mind.
Right.
He renounced his inheritance and everything that came with it.
Wow.
To pursue philosophy.
Talk about a major life decision.
Huge.
Yeah, he must have been incredibly driven to make that kind of sacrifice. So where did this passion for philosophy lead him? Did he just stay in his hometown and kind of hit the books?
Not at all. He was restless, always seeking out knowledge and new challenges.
Oh.
He traveled all over France, studying with various masters, even challenging them in public debates.
He sounds like a real intellectual rebel.
Oh, yeah.
Even from a young age. Yeah. So he's got that going for him.
He definitely had a knack for pushing boundaries.
Yeah.
And his reputation as a brilliant and provocative thinker grew with each debate he won.
I bet.
Eventually, his journey led him to Paris, where he established himself as a renowned teacher at the Cathedral School of Notre Dame.
Notre Dame. Wow.
Big time.
Yeah, so he was teaching at one of the most prestigious institutions of his time. I bet he was a popular professor.
He was incredibly charismatic and engaging, attracting students from all over Europe.
Wow.
They flocked to hear his lectures on logic, theology,
and
philosophy. But as you might expect, his unorthodox views and his tendency to challenge authority didn't always sit well with everyone.
I can imagine.
Especially within the church hierarchy.
So even though he was like a superstar teacher, there was some trouble brewing.
You could say that.
Yeah.
And this is where the story takes a dramatic turn. Remember the legendary love affair we mentioned? Happened right here in Paris. And had huge consequences for Abelard's life and career.
Okay, let's dive into that. Tell me about Héloïse.
Héloïse Argenteuil was a brilliant young woman known for her intellect and beauty. She was the niece of a powerful canon at Notre Dame, and Abelard became her tutor.
I can see where this is going. Tutoring sessions turned into something more.
Exactly. They fell deeply in love, and their affair became a scandal that rocked Parisian society. Remember, Abelard was a respected teacher and a cleric, and Héloïse was a young woman under his care.
So it was a forbidden love, full of passion and danger. What happened next?
Well, their secret didn't stay hidden for long.
Oh.
Héloïse became pregnant, and they had to find a way to protect her reputation and their future.
Oh, no.
They secretly married, but their happiness was short-lived.
Yeah, I have a feeling this is where the tragedy comes in.
You're right. Héloïse's uncle, furious about the whole situation, took revenge in a brutal way.
Oh, gosh.
He arranged for Abelard to be attacked, and well, let's just say the consequences were devastating.
That's awful. I can't imagine the pain and humiliation he must have endured. What happened to Héloïse?
Héloïse, to protect Abelard, entered a convent and became a nun. Abelard, deeply affected by the events, retreated to a monastery as well.
So their love story ended in heartbreak and separation. It's a stark reminder that even the most brilliant minds can be struck by tragedy. But even in the monastery, Abelard didn't completely disappear from the intellectual scene, did he?
Not at all. He continued to write and teach, grappling with complex theological questions and refining his philosophical ideas. He even attracted new students to the monastery, eager to learn from this controversial but undeniably brilliant thinker.
It's almost like the monastery became his new classroom, a place where he could continue to challenge conventions and push the boundaries of thought.
That's a great way to put it. And his ideas honed during this period of reflection and turmoil would go on to have a lasting impact on Western philosophy.
Okay, we've set the stage with Abelard's dramatic life story. Now let's dive into his groundbreaking ideas. I'm especially curious about this concept of nominalism. It sounds intriguing, but I'll admit I'm not entirely sure what it means.
Nominalism was one of Abelard's most significant contributions to philosophy. It challenges us to think differently about how we categorize and understand the world.
Okay.
To grasp it, let's start with a simple question. What do we mean when we use general terms like dog or human?
Well, I guess I'd say dog refers to all the dogs in the world.
Right.
And human refers to all humans. It's like we're grouping things based on their shared characteristics.
Exactly. But that's where the debate begins.
Okay.
Before Abelard, the dominant view, known as realism, held that these general terms, or universals as they're called, actually refer to real entities that exist independently of the individual things.
So realists believe that there's a kind of dogness or humanness that exists out there separate from all the actual dogs and humans. It sounds a bit abstract.
It is, and Abelard wasn't buying it. He argued that universals are nothing more than words, mental concepts we use to categorize individual things.
So for Abelard, there's no dogness floating around in some abstract realm.
Nope. Each dog is simply an individual, a particular being. And we use the word dog to group them together based on their shared similarities.
Okay.
But that doesn't mean there's some separate entity that defines what it means to be a dog.
Okay. I'm starting to see the appeal of nominalism. It feels more grounded, more focused on what's actually in the world. But didn't Abelard's view create problems for explaining how we can even talk about general concepts?
Yeah.
If there's no humanness to connect us, how can we make sense of being human?
That's a great question, and it's one that Abelard tackled head-on.
Okay.
He argued that even though there are no universals as real things, our words still have meaning because they refer to individual things that share similarities. We don't need some abstract humanness to explain why we call ourselves human. We just need to look at the shared characteristics of individual humans, our capacity for reason, our emotions, our physical form, and so on.
It's about recognizing patterns and similarities, not about appealing to some higher abstract entity.
Exactly. And this emphasis on individual things had a ripple effect on other areas of Abelard's thought, like his approach to metaphysics and logic. But before we get into those, do you have any other questions about nominalism?
Just one. How did this idea go over with his contemporaries? I imagine challenging such a fundamental concept must have caused quite a stir.
You're right. It was a radical departure from the prevailing views of the time, and it sparked heated debates.
Yeah.
Abelard's critics worried that his nominalism would undermine the foundations of knowledge and faith. But for his supporters, it was a breath of fresh air, a way to ground philosophy in the real world and open up new avenues of inquiry.
So a controversial idea, but one that would have lasting consequences for how we think about language knowledge and even reality itself.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And that's just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to Abelard's contributions. Next, we'll explore how this focus on individual things played out in his views on logic and how he revolutionized the way people thought about argumentation and reasoning.
Yeah. Sounds good.
Yeah.
All right, we've established that Abelard was a bit of a philosophical rock star, shaking things up with his nominalism and challenging those abstract universals. So how did that love for concrete individuals play out in his logic? Was he like, forget those syllogisms, let's talk about real stuff?
Well, not quite. He actually loved syllogisms.
That's right.
And considered them the gold standard of logical reasoning.
Okay.
But he also recognized that not all valid arguments fit neatly into that classical mold. There's more to reasoning than just plugging terms into a formula.
Oh, he wasn't throwing out the rule book entirely, more like expanding it.
Exactly. He saw logic as a tool for understanding how we connect ideas and draw conclusions from evidence.
Right.
And he wanted to make that tool sharper and more versatile. One of his key insights was recognizing that the same propositional content, the basic idea being expressed,
Right.
could have different forces depending on how it's used.
Okay, can you give me an example of that? It sounds a bit abstract.
Sure. Think about the statement, "It's raining outside."
Okay.
That same information can be used to make a statement of fact, like, "It's raining outside, so I'll take an umbrella."
Right.
Or it can be used to ask a question like, "Is it raining outside? I need to decide what to wear."
Right.
Or even express a wish like, "I wish it would stop raining outside. This picnic is ruined."
Ah, I see. Same information, different intentions. It's like how a single tool like a hammer can be used to build something or to tear it down,
Yeah.
depending on the user's goal.
That's a great analogy. And Abelard recognized that this distinction between force and content was crucial for understanding how arguments work.
Okay.
It's not enough to just look at the words themselves. We need to consider how they're being used, what the speaker is trying to achieve with them.
So he was basically saying that context matters. You can't just analyze an argument in a vacuum. You have to consider the speaker's intent and the purpose of the conversation.
Exactly. And this focus on the pragmatic aspects of language was pretty revolutionary for his time. He was really pushing the boundaries of what logic could do, showing how it could be applied to real-world situations, not just abstract theoretical problems.
Okay. I'm starting to see why he was considered such a logic whiz. It's like he took these rigid formal rules and made them more flexible, more applicable to the messy realities of human communication. But wasn't he also known for being really rigorous in his approach to logic? Didn't he have some pretty strict criteria for what counts as a valid argument?
He did. He believed that a conclusion is only valid if it's truly contained within the premises.
Okay.
It can't just be a coincidence or a lucky guess. It has to follow logically from what's been established before.
So he was all about making sure that the connections between ideas are rock solid, that there are no gaps in the reasoning.
Precisely. And this led him to distinguish between two types of entailment or logical consequence: complete and incomplete. Complete entailment is what you see in those classic syllogisms we talked about.
Like, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal.
Exactly. The conclusion is guaranteed by the form of the argument itself.
Right.
It doesn't matter what you substitute for the terms man and mortal, the logic still holds. But Abelard recognized that not all valid arguments are so neat and tidy. Sometimes the connection between premises and conclusion relies on something more than just formal structure.
So what did he call these messier arguments?
He called them incomplete entailments or topical inferences.
Okay.
They rely on background knowledge,
Right.
on assumptions about how the world works,
Okay.
to make the connection between premises and conclusion.
Can you give me an example? I'm having trouble picturing what that would look like.
Sure. Imagine someone argues, if someone is a human, then they are mortal. Socrates is a human, therefore Socrates is mortal. That seems like a pretty straightforward argument, right?
Yeah, it does.
But Abelard would point out that it relies on a hidden premise,
Right.
that humans are a kind of being that is subject to death.
Okay.
That's not a purely logical truth. It's a fact about the world, about biology, and the nature of life.
Ah, I see. The logic of the argument works, but it depends on us accepting this extra piece of information that's not explicitly stated.
Exactly. And Abelard was fascinated by these kinds of arguments, the ones that rely on background knowledge and implicit assumptions.
Yeah.
He believed that they played a crucial role in how we reason about the world, especially in fields like ethics and theology, where purely formal logic often falls short.
So he was broadening the scope of logic, showing how it could be used to analyze arguments about values, beliefs, and even religious doctrines. That's pretty impressive.
It is. And this attention to the nuances of language and reasoning would also inform his views on philosophy of language,
Right.
where he delved into the fascinating relationship between words, concepts, and the world they represent.
All right, let's talk about language then. I'm curious to know how Abelard, the master of logic and the champion of concrete particulars, approached something as complex and awful messy as human language. Did he try to systematize it to impose logical order on it?
He did in a way, but he also recognized that language is a living, evolving thing,
Yeah.
full of ambiguities and complexities that can't always be captured by rigid rules.
Right.
One of his key insights was distinguishing between two aspects of meaning: reference and sense.
Okay, let's break those down. What did he mean by reference?
Reference is simply what a word picks out in the world. So the name Socrates refers to a specific historical individual.
Okay.
The word dog refers to all those furry creatures we call dogs.
Straightforward enough, but what about sense? What makes that different from reference?
Think of sense as the information content of a concept, the way we understand a word or a phrase. So the word dog might evoke images of wagging tails, barking, fetching loyalty, and maybe even a few chewed-up shoes.
Ah, I see. Reference is about pointing, while sense is about understanding. It's like the difference between seeing a dog in the park and knowing what a dog is.
That's a great way to put it. And Abelard believed that this distinction was crucial for understanding how language works.
Okay.
He argued that words can have different senses, even if they refer to the same thing.
Can you give me an example of that?
Sure. Take the words morning star and evening star.
Okay.
They both refer to the same celestial object, the planet Venus, but they have different senses because they evoke different contexts and associations. One brings to mind the sunrise, the other the sunset.
That's fascinating. So even though the reference is the same, the way we understand those words, the images and ideas they evoke can be quite different?
Exactly. And this shows how language is more than just a system of labels.
Right.
It's a tool for shaping our thoughts,
Right.
for expressing nuances and conveying a whole world of meaning that goes beyond simple denotation.
It's like how a single word can be a portal to a whole universe of associations, memories, and emotions.
That's beautifully put. And Abelard was acutely aware of this power of language to shape our understanding. He believed that language wasn't just a tool for communication, it was also a tool for thinking.
Right.
By analyzing the structure of language, we can gain insights into the structure of our own minds.
So he was connecting language and thought in a really profound way.
Yeah.
It's like he was saying that to understand how we reason, we need to understand how we use words.
Precisely. And this insight would have a major impact on his philosophy of mind, where he explored the fascinating question of how our thoughts can be about things in the world.
Right.
But before we dive into that, do you have any other questions about his views on language?
Just one. How did this focus on sense and reference on the nuances of meaning tie back to his nominalism?
Yeah.
Did it cause any problems for his view that universals are just words?
That's a sharp observation. It did raise some tricky questions. If there are no universals as real entities, how can different words have the same sense? How can we all understand dog in roughly the same way, even though there's no dogness to unite them?
Right. That seems like a potential problem. How did Abelard address it?
He argued that even though there are no universals, our minds have a natural capacity to recognize similarities and form concepts based on those similarities. So when we see a bunch of furry, four-legged creatures that bark and wag their tails, our minds naturally group them together and form the concept dog.
So it's like our minds are pattern-seeking machines, constantly looking for ways to categorize and make sense of the world around us.
Exactly. And this ability to form concepts is what allows us to use language meaningfully to communicate with each other about general categories, even though there are no abstract entities corresponding to those categories.
It's like we're all playing this elaborate game of meaning-making, using words as tokens to represent our shared understanding of the world.
That's a great analogy. And Abelard was fascinated by how this game works, by the rules and strategies we use to construct meaning and navigate the complex landscape of human communication.
Okay, I'm really starting to appreciate the depth and subtlety of Abelard's thought. He wasn't just a logician. He was a philosopher of language, a cognitive scientist ahead of his time. He was trying to understand not just how we reason, but how we think, how we use symbols to represent the world and make sense of our place in it.
That's a great summary of his project. And this deep dive into language and meaning would lead him to explore even more profound questions about the nature of mind, consciousness, and intentionality.
All right, let's talk about the mind then. This is where things start to get really meta, right? How did Abelard approach this whole issue of intentionality, of how our thoughts can be about things in the world? I'm guessing he had some pretty innovative ideas about that too. All right, let's talk about the mind then. This is where things start to get really meta, right?
Mm-hmm.
How did Abelard approach this whole issue of intentionality, of how our thoughts can be about things in the world? I'm guessing he had some pretty innovative ideas about that too.
You bet he did. Intentionality was a hot topic back then, just like it is today. Philosophers were wrestling with this puzzle. How can our thoughts, which seem to be internal and immaterial, be directed towards things that are external and often physical?
Yeah, it's mind-boggling when you really stop to think about it. Like right now I'm thinking about Abelard, a guy who lived centuries ago. How is my mind reaching back through time and connecting with this historical figure?
That's the million-dollar question, and Abelard was way ahead of his time in trying to answer it. He rejected the traditional explanations that relied on forms literally entering the mind, or mental images resembling the objects of thought.
So he wasn't buying into the idea that we have little mini replicas of everything we think about floating around in our heads.
Nope. He argued that both those theories had serious problems. For starters, if forms literally entered the mind, wouldn't that give the mind physical properties? Which is obviously absurd.
Right. My brain doesn't suddenly become triangular if I think about a pyramid.
Exactly. And as for mental images, he pointed out that they're more like signs than pictures. They need to be interpreted to have meaning.
So I can have a mental image of a tree, but that image doesn't tell me whether I'm thinking about that specific tree, trees in general, or maybe even something completely unrelated, like a childhood memory associated with a tree.
That's a great example. The image itself is neutral. It's the act of attention that gives it meaning. We can direct our attention to different aspects of the image and thereby think about different things.
So for Abelard, it's this act of attention that's doing the heavy lifting when it comes to intentionality.
That's his key insight. He saw attention as an active mental process that directs our thoughts towards things in the world. Different acts of attention result in different kinds of intentional states.
It's like our attention is a spotlight. We can shine it on different parts of our mental landscape, illuminating different thoughts and meanings.
I love that analogy. And here's where Abelard gets really radical. He proposes a linguistic account of mental representation.
Wait, hold on. A linguistic account of the mind. How does that work?
He argued that we can understand how the mind works by looking at how language works. He saw language as a model for mental processes.
So he's saying that our thoughts have a kind of grammar or logic to them, similar to how sentences are structured.
You're getting it. He believed that our understandings are composed of simpler understandings, just like sentences are composed of words.
So my understanding of Abelard was a brilliant philosopher is built up from my understanding of Abelard was brilliant and philosopher.
Exactly. And the logical structure of the sentence mirrors the logical structure of my thought. It was a revolutionary idea, and one that laid the groundwork for later developments in philosophy of mind and cognitive science.
It's amazing how he keeps connecting these seemingly disparate areas of thought, logic, language. And now the mind, it's like he's weaving a tapestry showing how these different threads are all interconnected.
He was a true intellectual trailblazer. And speaking of trailblazing, we can't forget his contributions to ethics. This is where his radical intentionalism comes into play.
Intentionalism. Okay, I'm all ears. Tell me more.
Abelard was convinced that the moral worth of an action is determined solely by the agent's intention, consequences, outward deeds, even moral luck. None of that mattered to him. It was all about what was going on in the mind of the person acting.
Wow, that's a bold stance. So if someone trips and accidentally spills their coffee on me, it's not a big deal ethically because they didn't intend to do it.
That's the gist of it. He argued that judging actions based on outcomes leads to all sorts of problems. For example, what if two people have the same good intention, but one is prevented from carrying it out due to circumstances beyond their control? Should they be judged differently?
That makes sense. It seems unfair to punish someone for something they couldn't help. But doesn't this make morality very subjective? How can we judge someone's intentions if we can't see them?
That's a great question, and Abelard acknowledged this limitation. He believed that ultimately God is the only one who can truly judge intentions. However, that doesn't mean human justice is pointless.
So what's the point of human laws and punishments if we can't really know people's intentions?
Abelard argued that human justice serves primarily as a deterrent and a way to set examples. Punishing wrongdoing, even if we can't be certain of the intention, can discourage others from committing similar acts. It's about maintaining order and protecting society.
So it's more about shaping behavior than about judging the inner state of the individual.
That's a key part of his view. And his intentionalism goes even deeper. He argued that even the crucifiers of Christ weren't evil because they acted out of ignorance, not malice.
Hold on. He's saying the people who crucified Jesus weren't evil. That's a pretty controversial claim.
It definitely raised eyebrows. But remember, for Abelard, it all comes down to intention. He believed that acting against one's conscience is the real sin, and the crucifiers genuinely believed they were doing the right thing.
So even if their actions had horrific consequences, their intentions were what mattered ethically.
That was his radical view. Now, this obviously raises the question, if intentions are all that matter, how do we know which intentions are good? What's the guide for our conscience?
Right. It can't just be a free-for-all where any intention goes.
Exactly. And Abelard had an answer. He believed that the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, is the ultimate guide for moral intentions.
Ah, the golden rule. That seems like a solid foundation for morality. But even if we accept that, why should we care about being moral? What's the motivation?
Abelard believed that true happiness is inextricably linked to virtue to living a morally good life. He argued that this connection between happiness and virtue can be demonstrated through reason alone. It's not about external rewards or punishments. It's about the intrinsic goodness of living a virtuous life.
So it's about aligning our actions with our deepest values and striving to become the best versions of ourselves.
That's a great way to put it. And this emphasis on the connection between virtue and happiness would also inform his theological views, where he sought to reconcile faith and reason.
Yeah, let's talk about theology then. How did Abelard, the champion of reason, approach matters of faith?
Well, unlike some of his contemporaries, Abelard wasn't afraid to use reason to explore religious doctrines. He believed that reason could illuminate and clarify our understanding of faith, even though he recognized that reason had limits.
So he wasn't a fideist who thought faith and reason were completely separate.
Not at all. He was a key figure in the scholastic movement, which sought to harmonize faith and reason. But this stance got him into trouble with both the anti-dialecticians who rejected reason altogether and the pseudo-dialecticians who overemphasized reason's role.
So he was trying to find a middle ground between blind faith and arrogant rationalism.
Exactly. He criticized the anti-dialecticians for their rigid dogmatism and the pseudo-dialecticians for their overconfidence in reason's ability to solve every theological mystery.
So where did he land on the spectrum? How much weight did he give to reason?
He saw faith and reason as complementary, each with its own sphere of influence. Reason could be used to analyze and clarify theological concepts, but ultimately some truths might lie beyond reason's grasp. Faith was needed to bridge the gap.
Can you give me an example of how he applied reason to theology?
His work on the Trinity is a prime example. He used intricate logical arguments to try to make sense of this complex doctrine, which asserts that God is one being but three persons: Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. He developed a sophisticated theory of identity to explain how the three persons could be both distinct and united.
That sounds like some serious mental gymnastics. What was his conclusion?
He argued that reason could take us so far in understanding the Trinity, but ultimately some aspects remained beyond human comprehension. Faith was needed to complete the picture.
So he saw reason as a valuable tool, but not a magic bullet that could unlock all the mysteries of faith.
Exactly. And this nuanced approach is what makes his theology so fascinating. He wasn't afraid to push the boundaries of reason, but he also recognized its limitations.
It's a perspective that still resonates today as we grapple with the relationship between faith and science and try to make sense of the big questions about life, the universe, and everything.
Absolutely. Abelard's struggles and insights offer valuable lessons for anyone navigating the complex terrain where faith and reason intersect.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today, from Abelard's dramatic life to his groundbreaking ideas on metaphysics, logic, language, mind, ethics, and theology. I feel like I've just completed a whirlwind tour of 12th century thought.
It's been quite a journey, but as with any deep dive, the real exploration begins when you emerge from the water and start connecting what you've learned to the wider world.
So what's the takeaway for our listeners? What can we learn from this deep dive into Peter Abelard?
Abelard reminds us that intellectual curiosity, even when it challenges the status quo, can lead to profound insights. He encourages us to use reason to illuminate our understanding of the world, but to also recognize its limitations. And perhaps most importantly, he challenges us to think deeply about the nature of truth, meaning, and morality.
Those are some powerful lessons. And I think it's fitting to end this deep dive with a question for our listeners to ponder. In a world increasingly dominated by technology and instant answers, how can we cultivate the kind of intellectual humility and rigorous thinking that Abelard championed?
That's a question worth pondering indeed. And perhaps in the spirit of Abelard, the best way to find an answer is to keep asking questions, keep exploring, and keep diving deep into the rich and complex world of ideas.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the life and thought of Peter Abelard. Until next time, keep those minds curious and those questions coming.